nearly everyone thinks they have a messaging problem, but no one realizes the root of a messaging problem, which is positioning, right? And so long as you keep trying to solve the wrong problem, then guess what happens? You end up with the result that you don't want, right? You end up hiring messaging coaches or watching 42 YouTube videos around messaging or reading books or, pushing content and then wondering why has none of those things worked. So in this particular episode, it is really designed to help you diagnose what your real problem is so you can solve the right problem and thus get the right results. Okay. So one of the things that makes my coaching unique or different is, and this is not based on my own perception necessarily, I do agree with this take, but this is really based off of conversations that I've had with clients and each one of them saying the same thing separately, right? And I was like, oh yeah, that does make it different. One of the things that makes my coaching different is my ability to focus on the root rather than the symptom, okay? A while back, I was doing some customer research with a group of my clients individually, not just collectively. All right. Well, actually, both. We did some collective and some individual. And of course, I asked a multitude of questions about the program, about my coaching, about themselves, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the questions that I asked was what makes my coaching or what makes this program different than other programs or other coaching that you've experienced? And thus came this answer, right? Multiple people said the same thing, right? I come in thinking I have one problem and quickly realize I have a completely different problem I didn't even know existed, right? He's like that. She's like, that's what you helped me do, is stop spinning my wheel on the wrong thing because I was solving the wrong problem. And as I heard that, said different ways by different people, and I reflected, I was like, oh yeah, I do agree. Because of course, all client feedback is not accurate, just so we're clear. But I think number one, it's always important to be getting client feedback. That's a whole nother podcast. And especially when you hear the same thing repeatedly, whether it be positive or negative, it definitely warrants at least a pause and a reflection. Okay. So I credit this to my therapy days, right? For those of you who do not know that I was a therapist, well, technically I still am a therapist because I still hold multiple licenses, but I don't practice. And so, but when I was practicing for decades, I credit this to those therapy days because one of the crucial parts of being a therapist is diagnosis, right? There are thousands. I might be exaggerating. There's hundreds of diagnoses and what we call the DSM, which is all of the different diagnoses that you can have for your mental health. And you have to have a pretty good understanding of those things in order to understand how to treat someone. So that comes mostly from that background and that experience. But the other thing that I was thinking about as I, was reflecting on client feedback was this also comes from my branding background, right? So one thing I don't talk about nearly as often is that I have multiple certifications. They're basically the way that this program works under becoming a brand strategist is there are 3 levels of certification under Marty Newmeyer, which most people won't recognize. But if you're in the branding space, then you definitely know who he is because he's kind of like the godfather of branding. And I sometimes forget because it's so innate now. That was a long time ago that I went through those programs. And because of how I've positioned myself in the marketplace in different times, I sometimes forget that I have that also as a foundational, level understanding. And so both of these things together, right, I'm able to apply my therapy skills to business concepts like positioning and messaging, because positioning and messaging are far more of branding concepts than they are business concepts. Now, we could, so one could argue, right? Don't with me, just so we're clear, argue with your mom. But one could argue that messaging is more of a business concept because it falls underneath marketing in a lot of ways. right? Although your messaging definitely goes beyond your marketing, it spans your entire brand. But one could argue you're welcome to do so. Okay. So let me give you an example of what I think is happening for most entrepreneurs, right? That is actually keeping them stuck or stagnant or constantly making shifts and pivots. Okay. Again, if I use a very simple analogy, right? I'm thinking of my mother's heat went out not long ago. And naturally, most people would think that it's the furnace, right? And so people come in, landlords and property managers and all the people who do things in the house, right? Uh, are looking at the phone and furnace to figure out, what's the problem. And it turns out she needed a new water heater, right? So it's like a classic example of I thought it was one problem, but it turns out it's another problem, right? And we really could apply that same concept to a million things in our own individual lives. It happens with our cars, our kids, our health, our business, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. But one of my favorite stories to tell, like this is literally because it's so revolutionary. It's one of my favorite stories to tell when I'm trying to help people understand the importance of solving the wrong problem. Because I could use an example that's about kids or cars, but it doesn't hit quite the same unless I use a business example and a business example from a brand that is reputable, that the vast majority of the world loves. And so I want to use the example of the NBA and the story of basically the beginning of the NBA when it was early on. Okay. So, if you've been around a little while, you know that I read a lot of books. And one of my favorite books to read are stories about brands, right? So the Starbucks, the Apples, the Nikes, et cetera, et cetera. Side note, if you have not read the book Shoe Dog, which is a different version of it's like the Nike story. Okay. It's fantastic. It's one of my favorite books. Okay, so this one is specifically about the NBA. Okay. So here's a little context that I think would help you as you move along here, because it doesn't apply just to messaging positioning, but it 100% applies to this point that I'm making. Right. Because again, if you keep saying you have a messaging problem, right, then you look for messaging solutions. Right. And if in fact you don't have a messaging problem, then guess what? Those solutions do not work. Okay. So in short, the NBA started by combining two other organizations slash leagues and forming the NBA, which was basically around 1949. Okay. And the main problem that they felt like they had, or another way to say it, is that their revenue came from ticket sales. Okay. In the early days, they were not being paid through endorsements and TV and media and, all these other things. It was just straight ticket sales, right? So naturally, if ticket sales are low, then guess what? I feel like I have a ticket sales problem or a sales problem, so to speak. Okay. And so as they went to try to solve that sales problem, or ticket problem, however you want to look at it, one of the main ways that they tried to solve that problem was by giving the owners of the teams permission to move their franchises around, right? And the logic behind that was that, oh, we need to find an audience, right? And attendance. That's what I want you to be able to think about. Where could I go where people would be interested in this league, in this team? Okay. That was the logic behind giving owners permission to be able to make that move. And so what ended up happening is that a lot of owners moved their teams, and many of them moved several times before they actually found, permanent homes. Okay. So think of this like, for the next couple of years. So if the NBA started in 1949, let's say this is 1951, 52 kind of ish. Okay. And so then the question becomes, well, did it work? Right? Did they solve the problem that they were trying to solve? And the answer is no. Right? What ended up happening was several owners failed miserably, actually. And they ultimately could not secure the cities, the audience, etc., to be able to support the ticket sales that they needed. And the results, right, that the impact of that is that the NBA dropped from having 17 teams down to 10 in the second season. I want you to hear that. The second season, not over 5 or 10 years. No, this was a quick drop. If I started in 1949 and by 1950, I've dropped 7 teams. And then by the start of the following, well, no, not the following year. Let's say the start of the 1955-56 season. So basically 5 or 6 years later, they're down to 8. Okay. So the point that I want you to hear initially is that over a 6-year period of time, they did not solve this ticket sale / revenue problem, and they lost over half of their teams. Okay. So I want you to see that there was a 6 years worth of cost, lost revenue, because they were solving the wrong problem. And really, if we really want to be honest, it was 20 years of revenue that was lost, even though they started to solve the problem before that 20-year mark. And the reason is because it wouldn't be until 1970, which is 21 years later, right, that the NBA would actually get back to its original 17 teams in the league. So I want you to hear that. Naming the wrong problem cost them over 20 years. And 20 years of what? Not just low ticket sales, but all of the things that would have come if they would have solved that problem sooner. Okay? So long story short, the way that they ended up fixing this, because that went on for years and years where they just could not get their ticket sales up, they hired a consultant. Many of you probably have heard of Peter Drucker, who basically helped them identify the real problem and develop a strong business plan to try to get them out of this ongoing problem. Okay. And so then the question becomes, well, what was the real problem? Right? Because a lot of times when we have low sales in our business, we think a similar thing. Oh, I have a sales problem. And it's like, yes, the sales problems is a symptom. It's not a root. Right? It's not the root cause. It's like just a symptom of a larger or different or deeper problem. Okay, so one of the things that Peter Drucker helped them do is to see that what they really had, with the problem that they were actually struggling with, was a product problem. Okay, the NBA was a business without an exciting product, right? And what I mean by that is that the games were very methodical, the fans were bored, the scoring was low, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you don't have a good product, then of course, moving from city to city isn't going to solve that problem. You still have a bad product. I'm not even going to harp on the fact that most of y'all got bad products. Not because you're not experts, not because you're not hardworking. That's a whole different podcast. This is not about product. This is about naming the problem correctly. Okay. They hit really an all-time low. I want to say this was in 1954, if I'm not mistaken, where it was a Pistons game and the winning score, okay, the end of the game was 1918. Now, if you know anything about basketball, the average score for an NBA player, for an NBA team, is in the 90s, okay? Not 19 and 18, but 90s and 100s, okay? So I want you to hear that the real problem that they had was a product problem, right? And in that the games were slow. So how could you see how solving the wrong problem leads to the wrong solution and then costs you time, money, and energy? But what was amazing is that once they figured out they had a product problem and that what was really happening was that the games were just boring, what they ended up doing was instituting the 24-second shot clock violation. And why? Because that sped the game up, right? Now people just can't hold the ball and be slow, which again, that was the core problem, is that the game was just boring, right? That was about 1954, 55, right? And as the game sped up, guess what? The product got better, right? And that was the core decision that changed the trajectory of their business. Now they went on to make other improvements to the product, right? Basically other rules to the game, right? Goaltending, moving the foul line, things like that. But the catalyst was really this 24-second shot clock violation. Okay. So hopefully you understand the importance of solving the right problem. Okay. Because if you don't, you end up in the same space in your business for years. All right. So now let's talk about messaging and positioning. Okay. So in short, messaging is basically just what words do you say, right? To get people to take the step that you want them to take. It's just that simple, right? It doesn't matter whether you're talking about your website, whether you're talking about, a lead magnet, whether you're talking about a sales page, your content on social, et cetera, et cetera. Messaging is just what words do I say, right? In order for them to do what I need them to do. So let's say that you've already created an offer, you packaged that offer, right? You know what's in it, what's not in it, why those things are in it, right? All the things that go into packaging an offer. And now you need to communicate the value of that offer, right? That means you have a messaging problem, right? Or let's say that people are landing on, your lead magnet page, right? But your conversions are low, right? There's a good chance that you have a messaging problem. Right now, you could have other problems there, but again, primarily, you probably have a messaging problem, right? There are lots of things that fall under that purview, right? That could be considered messaging problems. Positioning, right, is basically the things that you do to occupy a specific or distinct place in a person's mind. That's what positioning is. So here's the difference, okay? What book? I was reading a book. I can't remember the name of the book, but it was, of course, about positioning. And in short, the quote said, "Positioning is not what you do to the product; it is what you do in the mind of the prospect." That's the difference, right? Positioning really answers the question of why you. Why should someone choose you instead of choosing someone else, right? Whereas messaging answers the problem of how do I articulate that answer. So if I say, let's use the example of me when I started this podcast episode, right? And I said, oh, part of what makes me different, i.e. the positioning, is that I have the ability to get to the root and not just solve the surface of a problem. Well, if I go out and start talking about, that's a positioning thing, right? But if I go out and start talking about diagnosis, I'm going to lose half my audience because they're not therapists. They don't understand the nuances that come with that, right? And so messaging is about, well, how do I communicate the value of diagnosis to a business owner? That's what messaging would solve, okay? And when you're answering the question, right, how would I say this? When you're answering the question of why someone should choose you, you don't do that just with words, right? Words is one way that you demonstrate your value, right? But you also do that in your offers. You also do that in your pricing. You also do that in your business model, et cetera, et cetera. So messaging can be included in positioning, but positioning is much bigger than messaging. Okay, hopefully that makes good sense to you. One of the things that I want you to be able to hear is that if you have a messaging problem, that's like copywriting work, right? You hire a copywriter or someone who's actually good at writing if, in fact, you have a messaging problem, right? So that way you clearly communicate various elements of your brand so your audience can see your value, okay? But when you are positioning, that's not copywriting work, right? That's strategy work. Because what you're doing is you're taking pieces of you your brand, your business, and you're ensuring that they fit together in a way that aligns with the position that you want to hold in your ideal client's mind, right? You see how much different that is? And when I say you, your brand, and your business, I mean, when you think of positioning, you have to align, let's say that your gift, right? So let's use my diagnosis skill as an example. That is a gift or a skill set that I have. And I have to take that skill set and I have to align it with my brand, meaning what is my brand all about? What am I helping people? What do I believe in? I have to take that. So, and one of the things that our brand is about is that I do not like the fact that helpers, right, people who really are in helping professions, teachers, lawyers, therapists, nurses, blah, 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 right, coaches, consultants, people who really have a heart for people often get paid the least. Like, think about it. They literally get paid the least in our society. I do not like that. And then they end up living in survival mode. And so I have to take this skill of diagnosis and connect it to one of the philosophies or uh, principles of our business, which is to help helpers get out of survival mode. Okay. So I got to take those two things and then I have to add on to it the business aspect. That philosophy or that principle is at the brand level, it's not at the business level. Okay. And so I still got a whole nother layer that I need to add and make sure it fits together. Because you could easily see how my skill of diagnosis and helping helpers get out of survival mode, those don't automatically connect, right? I have to actually demonstrate the connection, which is the messaging part. I have to first make sure that I have the pieces. My skill is a piece, which is the you part, my brand and why we exist, right? And then the business, which is, well, what's my marketing strategy? What's my sales strategy? What is my product suite? I have to take all three of those things and put them together like a puzzle and make sure they fit together. That is positioning, right? If I am a luxury brand, as an example, and I only sell high-end stuff, then I have to position myself a certain way so that way my audience sees the value of that. Versus if I'm on the low end side, right? Neither one is good or bad. They just have different positioning. Okay. They're serving different audiences. So what I want you to hear is that many people do have a messaging problem. Like, and indeed they do. Right. But in actuality, if you don't solve the positioning problem first, the messaging will never work. Positioning can include messaging, but that's just one aspect. Okay. So I want to give you another example that I think demonstrates positioning well, because positioning is one of those things that it can sometimes be hard to wrap your mind around. Like, I get what you're saying, LaChelle, but like, what are you really saying? Like, give me an example of what you mean by positioning. I'm glad you asked. I shall do it. Okay. Because I want you to see that positioning is strategy work, right? It is not going off to learn, right? A new marketing skill, a new sales skill. No, it is putting the pieces together of let's say you have a 100 piece puzzle, or maybe even 1,000 piece puzzle, right? Depending on what you're building, right? The more complex the thing that you're building, the bigger the thing you're building, the more pieces you have in your puzzles. And also, the more you have to make sure that those pieces fit together. Okay, so here's a perfect example. Southwest uh did such a great job of positioning, i.e., strategy. One, because they knew what they were wanting to become and stand for. In short, they basically wanted to be a substitute for Greyhound, right? At the time that they, got their start, Greyhound was really big, but they really wanted a more convenient way to get around and simultaneously at a price that wasn't extraordinarily great. Okay. At a similar price, not the same price as you would get for a Greyhound, but very close. Okay. Notice that they understood why they existed. Okay. And so then the question becomes, well, how the heck do you do that? Right? How do you become the Greyhound or basically be what Greyhound is to buses, but for air, okay, and flights. And so they had to put their heads together, right? And they had to come up with all of these things that would allow them to reach their specific goal, okay? The first thing is that you have to be able to figure out, well, what's the problem that we have to solve? When we start talking about strategy work, we're like, well, how do we accomplish this thing, this goal that we're going after? And so the main thing that they really had to focus on was keeping their costs low, right? So that way they could afford to be able to keep the price low, right? And it's like, okay, well, how do you do that and still be profitable? And so they had all of these things that a strategy has a lot to do with what you do and what you don't do. Okay. And so they did things like decided that they were going to fly spoke to spoke instead of hub to spoke. Right. So a lot of times in those days, and really still now, airplanes did not fly direct city to city as often. They fly from one city to a hub and then from that hub to the next city, et cetera. They didn't. Southwest says, no, we're not doing that because that's going to cost us more money. They also chose to only fly one aircraft, right? Why? Because then they could create training and people could master this one aircraft. They could clean it quicker. They could learn all the mechanics of it quicker. There's all the pluses of just having one aircraft versus lots of different planes, right? They won't offer meals. You can only book online, not travel agents, et cetera, et cetera. I could keep going, but you get the point, right? That's what positioning looks like. It's strategy work. This is not a messaging problem, right? You see how this has to be done first in order to then go off and create strong messaging around your positioning, okay? Most messaging experts cannot help you do this work. That's not, they're typically trained in like copywriting and things like that, not strategy. And so the question that I want to ask you is, do you have a messaging problem, a positioning problem, or both? And if you have a positioning problem, solve that problem first, right? When you do things in the right order, like I cannot stress this enough. Even if you didn't fully understand what I said about messaging and positioning, number one, go back and listen to it again. But this part of the podcast might be the most important part that I might ever say, okay? Is that when you do things in the right order, because you could be doing the right thing. Like a lot of entrepreneurs are hardworking. They put in 50 hours a week, right? And oftentimes they're doing the right thing. They're pushing content on social, right? The problem is they're doing things in the wrong order. The order matters, right? Because when you do things in the right order, you get the benefits of compound psychology, which is basically just a compound effect, but related to people instead of numbers. And in short, to make it really simple, it's about learning how to move sequentially and not simultaneously. There are moments where simultaneous makes sense, but much of business is about sequential. That's what I want you to hear. Notice the dramatic pause there. It really wasn't that dramatic, but I'm making it dramatic. Okay, because what we all want is to be able to put one thing in and get two things out, or put one thing in and get 10 things out. It's called leverage. That's what the compound effect does, right? That's what compound psychology is all about. Is how do I put one thing in, right? And then I get way more return for that one thing. That's what you're after in business. So that way you're not always hustling. It's just leverage. Okay. But this is really one of the biggest reasons why entrepreneurs fail or take, 20 years to get to seven figures, or never get to seven figures, or whatever their particular goal is, because they don't understand compound psychology. I'm actually creating some content specifically around this theoretical perspective to help people understand it. So eventually you'll be able to go to compoundpsychology.com and get a better understanding of what I'm talking about. So keep a lookout. Depending on the time that you're watching this or listening to this podcast, it might already be up, right? The point is that is what creates leverage. Most people actually have a positioning problem and a messaging problem. not just a messaging problem. And if you fail to solve the positioning problem, you already know what happens, right? So if you know you need help with positioning and your messaging, right, you should definitely check out the Helper School. Join the wait list if the cohort is not currently taking clients. It's a great place for you to be able to learn how to position yourself and then begin the process of creating your messaging for your brand.